Thank you very much. I was about to spend the first 2 or 3 minutes explaining why I'm here, but fortunately Brandon's done it for me. I hope that what I have to say will encourage other people to work more systematically on the topics. What I'm going to say largely coincides with what I said in chapter 11 of the second edition of my book, Revelation, but not entirely. And I do hope many of you will take these issues further. As we all know, traditional Christian thinking on many moral issues, but in particular on sex, family, and termination of life, is regarded by all non-religious and by some religious believers as totally and evidently mistaken. Of the issues in this area, I shall take the time to consider only very briefly, the issues of adultery, divorce, fornication, homosexual sexual acts, contraception, abortion, suicide, and euthanasia, all of which have been declared morally wrong by traditional Christian morality. And I shall also consider the traditional teaching that the husband is the head of the family, and so wife and children have an obligation to obey him. My main concern will be with the general principles for determining whether and why traditional Christian teaching on these issues is correct, rather than with any particular solutions to each issue. In this paper, I seek to analyze the general structure of any plausible defense of traditional views on these issues. All arguments in philosophy begin from premises. All arguments about anything, I think, begin from premises, and my arguments in this paper begin from many premises, some of them much disputed. They are, however, all premises which can themselves be defended by arguments quite independent of the issues of the present paper, and I have myself tried to defend all of them at some time or other. So here are my premises. They are all on the handout. Number 1. The fundamental moral principles are necessary truths independent of the existence, nature, or will of God, and many of them are discoverable by humans. These principles are principles about which states of affairs are intrinsically good and which actions are morally good, and among the latter, which actions are morally obligatory, or duties, and what we call negative obligations, that is to say, which actions are wrong. Moral obligations, I suggest, are always one person's obligations to some other person. One cannot have obligations to oneself, as they can't have debts to oneself. In a certain sense, an obligation is a debt. Positive obligations, I suggest, obligation to do something as opposed to refrain from doing something, arise only either from commitments made by a person to another person, explicitly or implicitly, or from benefits received. I repeat that, and I'll come back to it in due course. Moral obligations, positive obligations, for example, to pay you money, arise either from commitments made explicitly, perhaps in this case, or implicitly, or alternatively from benefits received. Right, that's my first assumption. Quite contestable, I know, but we're going on from there. 2, among the fundamental moral principles is a fundamental moral principle that beneficiaries have an obligation to please their benefactors, and to please them to a greater degree, the greater the benefit. If the beneficiary is able either to accept or reject a gift, he or she must accept it before the obligation arises. But if the beneficiary is not in this position, then if the gift is an evidently good gift, the obligation still arises. It is for that reason that children have an obligation to please their nurturing parents, who have given them much love, care, sustenance, and education before the children were in any position to accept or reject these gifts. An obligation to a benefactor includes an obligation to treat the gift with respect and to use it only for the kinds of purpose for which, explicitly or implicitly, it was given. Hence, if an aunt gives a child a new dress for Christmas, the child has an obligation not to cut it up and use it to make something else, or to use it to wipe up some spilt milk, but the child has an obligation to treat it with respect. She may not actually wear it, but at any rate, she mustn't do the sort of things I've suggested to it. 3. God is our creator, and everything we are and have is a gift from God, except those few gifts given to us by others, principally our parents, whose ability to give these gifts is itself a gift from God. Hence, we have an enormous obligation to please God, which, given premise 2, includes an obligation to treat his gifts to us with respect, and to use them only in the ways which, explicitly or implicitly, God laid down. God's instructions for the use of these gifts are his commands to us. 4. God does only good actions, actions for which there is a reason. Hence, he will only command some action which it is good that he should command. 5. God has reason to command us to do those actions which are obligatory, and to forbid those actions which are wrong, obligatory or wrong, for reasons independent of whether God has commanded or forbidden them. And I shall call such actions either intrinsically obligatory or wrong, actions whose obligatoriness and wrongness doesn't consist in them having been commanded by God. The reason why God might nevertheless command us to do them, even though they are obligatory anyway, may be either to inform us of obligations which we have not discovered for ourselves, or to draw our attention to them. We may be aware of them, and so to put pressure on us to conform to them. For one or other of these reasons, parents often tell their children to do what the children are obliged to do anyway, and often realize that they are obliged to do anyway. 6. God, like any other benefactor, such as parents or the state, has reasons to command humans to do actions which would not otherwise be obligatory. These reasons include a. Coordinating imperfectly obligatory actions so as to ensure the realization of a good overall goal. What I mean by an imperfectly obligatory action is an action such that you have an obligation to do some action of that kind, but not any particular action. For example, to give money to a charity, but not to this charity. So, there are reasons, God may have reasons to coordinate some of our imperfectly obligatory actions so as to ensure the realization of a good overall goal. This coordination may involve telling different humans to do different actions. God may tell Jonah to preach to Nineveh and some other prophet to preach to Babylon, and so on, in order to ensure that his message is heard everywhere. Otherwise, the prophets might all preach to Nineveh, and Babylon and other cities would not then hear the message. But the coordination of imperfect duties may require instead everyone to do the same action, when many other same actions would be equally good, so long as everyone did them. God may tell all Christians to worship together each week on a Sunday rather than on a Thursday, in order to ensure that the Christian community worship together, although there might be no particular reason for worshipping on that day or worshipping once a week or whatever. Right, that's one reason why he may command humans to do actions which would not otherwise be obligatory, to ensure coordination of imperfectly obligatory actions. The reasons also include B, getting humans to do actions of a kind which would be good only if many similarly positioned humans did the same actions. It's good to fight for your country in a just war. If you have some prospect of success, That will be the case only if many others of your countrymen do the same. If there are not many volunteers, the state will need to impose conscription and so make many others obliged to fight. In due course, I shall be suggesting in particular cases where God needs to impose obligations for that kind of reason. Thirdly, the reasons may include C, getting us, for our sake, into the habit of doing more than we are obliged to do. Getting people to do what otherwise would be supererogatory for the above or any other reasons serves this additional good purpose of beginning to make them naturally good people. Parents rightly get their children into habits of doing more for family, neighbours and others than they are strictly obliged to do. Parents want their children to be naturally good people. So too does God. And God, who wants the very best of us, wants us to be saints. It seems to me that the command of Jesus to the young man to, quote, sell what you owe and give money to the poor, close quote, is designed to serve that purpose. It's not primarily for the poor purpose, it's primarily, that of course is an important purpose, but for the young man's purpose. On the other hand, God gave some different command, or Jesus was satisfied with Zacchaeus giving only half his goods to the poor. So there are different commands to different people for this purpose of making them saints. And whenever God commands individuals or particular groups, particular classes, kinds, to do actions for any of these previous reasons, there is the additional good that the individual or group is selected for a special task. To be selected by the commander for a particular role in his plan is always a privilege. 7. Jesus Christ was God incarnate, and for that reason his teaching about important moral issues is true. He founded a church to interpret and develop that teaching, and so he ensures that any virtually unanimous church teaching over a long time on such issues is also true. That teaching may include teaching both about what are the fundamental moral principles and also about what are the actions which become obligatory solely in virtue of God's existence or command. 8. That teaching is included in the Bible as interpreted and developed by the Church, and perhaps also, if it doesn't conflict with the Bible, in some extra-biblical teaching. The Church, which authenticated the Bible as God's revelation, had for the first 1400 years of its existence certain rules for interpreting the Bible, in particular in respect of its moral teaching. One such rule, stated by Augustine, is, quote, to recognize that some commands are given to all in common, others to particular classes of people. Some commands weren't meant for everybody, others were. A second rule is that, as the Bible itself declared, the apostles inspired by the Holy Spirit declared that the whole Mosaic law no longer applies. The only part which remained was, according to the account of the First Council of Jerusalem in the Acts of the Apostles, the only part of the Mosaic law which remained obligatory was, quote, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication, close quote. Follows that any part of the Old Testament teaching which could be regarded as Mosaic law no longer applies. Appeals to the Bible for moral teaching must therefore normally rely on appeals to the New Testament. A third rule, Augustine's again, but echoed by many others, that, quote, whatever there is in the Word of God that cannot, when taken literally, be referred either to purity of life or to soundness of doctrine, you may set down as metaphorical, close quote. This rule assumes that the Christian comes to the text with a prior understanding of what constitutes, quote, purity of life or soundness of doctrine. That is, that the Bible must be interpreted in the light of the Church's prior understanding of these things. So we who come to the text must understand it in the same way. That is, in the light of any understanding we may have of which passages were seen as the key to interpreting other passages, and with any knowledge we may have of the Church teaching about purity of life or soundness of doctrine, apart from that recorded in the Bible. Although this third rule, unlike the previous one, is not itself contained in the Bible, it seems a natural one to use, since the Church selected which books should be part of the Bible, partly on the basis of their conformity to a prior understanding of what the Christian message was. And since it was for the first time only in the year 361 AD that there was any bishop ever published any list of the books currently contained in our Bible, unless one adopts that rule, one has the conclusion that people before then couldn't have a full understanding of the materials from which they could draw out an understanding of the Christian message. Okay, those are 8 premises, all of them highly disputable, but we could talk about them, and I certainly have argued elsewhere about them. But starting from there, I can now apply these results. I apply these results to the issues which I listed, on which traditional Christian views hold that some action is wrong or obligatory, while secular morality denies that. I begin by asking whether any of the actions traditionally forbidden, and currently disputed, traditionally forbidden, are intrinsically wrong. In my view, only adultery, late abortion, suicide, and so euthanasia are intrinsically wrong. Adultery is condemned by the 7th of the 10 Commandments, and the condemnation was reinforced by the clear implications of the teaching of Jesus. I understand by marriage a union of man and woman who have solemnly promised lifelong fidelity to each other. That was, whatever may be some people's modern understanding, that was certainly taken for granted in the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And that's what the command's about. And so I understand by adultery sexual intercourse between a man and a woman, at least one of whom is married to someone else without that other spouse's permission. This is clearly a breach of the solemn promise, and for that reason manifestly wrong, quite independent of anything God may say about it. And even much secular morality will agree with that. For the same reason, divorce with remarriage without mutual consent would be wrong. Secular morality, on the other hand, allows that. The recipient of a promise can always release the promiser from their obligation to keep a promise. And so intercourse outside marriage with the consent of the other spouse cannot be wrong for this reason. But if divorce with remarriage is wrong, as I shall be arguing in due course, such intercourse will be wrong for the same reason. Okay, so leaving aside the question of divorce, especially pointing out that if adultery is wrong because it's the breach of a solemn promise, then divorce without the consent of the other party would also be wrong for the same reason. But divorce with the consent of the other party is not, of course, covered by that. And sexual intercourse outside marriage with the consent of the other party is also not covered by that. Okay, so adultery is clearly wrong for non-theistic reasons. I now turn to abortion. Whether abortion is condemned in the Bible depends on how various texts are interpreted. The Septuagint translation of Exodus 23 claims that if an embryo is aborted by people fighting causing a miscarriage in a pregnant woman, then, quote, life is given for life if the embryo is formed. In other words, it's claiming that a life abortion constitutes a serious wrong deserving capital punishment. However, that's only in the Septuagint, and the Hebrew doesn't carry any such implication. And then there are references to pharmakia, the practice of giving drugs in one or two places in the New Testament, which is condemned. And it may well be that the drugs being referred to are abortion-making drugs, but that's not clear either. So any biblical support condemning abortion is pretty weak. On the other hand, abortion at any stage of pregnancy was condemned by the unanimous Christian teaching from the earliest fathers onwards, from the letter of Barnabas in the beginning of the 2nd century onwards, at least until the last century, and so may reasonably be held to constitute central Christian teaching. Once a fetus is a particular human being, then abortion will be killing that individual. Killing another human except to save another human life, or perhaps as a punishment for killing, is also, I suggest, intrinsically wrong. Why it's wrong is for the reason which is well put in an article by Don Marquis that some of you may know, that abortion deprives the human fetus of, quote, a future like ours. At least so long as it is already a human, then it deprives that human of all his future, and for that reason is surely wrong. But everything now turns on the issue of at what stage of development does the fetus become a particular individual person. The 1994 Catechism of the Catholic Church held that the embryo, quote, must be treated from conception as a person. However, it seems to me, as a substance dualist, that a person is a mental substance whose identity is determined by his non-physical soul, and that there are grounds for postulating such a soul only when there are grounds for postulating that the fetus is conscious. And it seems to me that there are such grounds only at a stage where the brain exhibits patterns of neural activity typical of conscious humans, maybe after 22 weeks. And I don't see myself any reason to suppose that before that time it is determined which soul will be connected to the fetus. The fetus is just growing, and the identity of the person is the identity of the thinker. Then until there is a thinker, there is no particular person. And the only reason to suppose there is a thinker is when the brain has reached a certain stage producing thoughts. So, from that, it would seem to follow that abortion at any stage does not deprive a particular individual of life like ours until the time comes when there is a particular individual, and I can't see that a substance dualist has any good reason for supposing that there is such an individual at the early stage. What is happening at the early stage is, as it were, the body is being developed in such a way as to be suited for a particular individual, we don't know who. And so, if you're a substance dualist, abortion before that point is not intrinsically wrong. It may, however, still be wrong for a different reason. I'll come to that issue in due course. On the other hand, if you are physicalistically minded and think that the individual is there from the very conception, then it is depriving a future individual of a life like ours, and it must be wrong for just the same reason. The obligation not to commit suicide, to come on to my third example of possibly intrinsically wrong actions, the obligation not to commit suicide is one recognized today by almost all Christians, but it cannot claim any biblical authority or any church authority before the 4th century. It is nevertheless, despite this, I suggest, an intrinsic obligation to the extent that in the sense that the obligation exists independently of God's commanding it, But in this case, unlike the other two cases I've just been considered, it depends on the existence of God, or not, although unlike the ones I'm going to consider, it doesn't depend on the command of God. It arises from God having created us. Sometimes there would be an obligation not to commit suicide to other humans, those who have a right to our help and love, such as our children. Aristotle thought that suicide constituted a wrong to the community, who has a right to our services. But that seems to me to exaggerate the rights of the community. Surely the universally applicable reason is that, as Aquinas claimed, it's a wrong to God, who has given us life, to chuck it back at him. To chuck it back at him when it's not as satisfactory as it should be. The gift of life is such a large gift that we should do our best to make our life a good life, however difficult the circumstances. To throw it away before it has reached its natural end would be like the act of a child who throws away a valuable toy at the moment it doesn't work very well. But clearly there are limits to the obligation to try to make the toy work, and so by analogy there are limits to the obligation to take extraordinary measures to keep ourselves alive. For example, by refusing to take painkillers rather than letting ourselves die. And if suicide is wrong, so too must be euthanasia, in the sense of helping someone to commit suicide. For to help someone to do wrong is itself wrong. It goes without saying in this case and in some of the other cases I'm going to mention that one's first reaction to any suicide can only be sorrow and compassion for the suffering, actual or foreseeable, which leads to the suicide. But I suggest that objectively, given that there is a God, suicide is wrong, although we can easily understand why someone might commit suicide. Nevertheless, I suggest objectively it is wrong. And I suggest that if there were no God, I can't see a reason why suicide would always be wrong, because in many cases there wouldn't be an obligation to anyone else to keep yourself alive. Now, I can't see that any of the actions which I listed, prohibited by traditional Christian teaching, other than adultery, late abortion, suicide, and euthanasia, are intrinsically wrong. The Catholic natural laws tradition has sought to show that these other actions are in some way disordered or unnatural actions, and for this reason wrong. And the best contemporary statement of this tradition known to me is Alex's book, One Body. Alex argues that bodily organs have functions, quote, functions, and that they, quote, strive or, quote, try to fulfill their functions, for example. Prasad argues, for example, that the penis has the function in intercourse of emitting semen into a vagina, which it strives to do, and that to prevent it from doing this is unnatural and so wrong. It seems to me, however, that to strive or try is an intentional action which only intentional agents can do, and that even if I am mistaken about this, it still doesn't follow that it would be morally wrong to do what is simply unnatural. It has to be established by a different sort of argument. And I find the Catholic, what I have chosen as the best example of the Catholic natural law tradition, does suffer from just this. There's an awful lot of talk about unnatural behavior and what we're fitted for and so on and so forth. But all right, it is unnatural and some behavior, and we're not readily fitted for it, but that doesn't make it wrong, and so we need different sorts of arguments. So I pass to consider the other moral issues on which, in my view, the correctness of the traditional view depends on God having commanded their observance. In considering each issue, I shall consider first to what extent the traditional view is well rooted in the Bible and or early Christian tradition, And I shall then go on to consider whether God would have a reason of a kind mentioned in premise 6, whether God would have some sort of reason for commanding its observance. While it may be reasonable to believe that God has issued a particular command, even though we cannot think of any possible reason why he might have done so, it would be unreasonable to believe this with respect to many purported commands, since this would begin to make it implausible to suppose that the Bible and Christian tradition can tell us much about God's commands. So you might not be able to explain one of them, but if you can't explain all of them, there must be something wrong. I begin with remarriage after divorce, and I shall simply call that divorce. And I shall consider it, together with the prohibition of sexual intercourse outside marriage, which we can call fornication, the traditional name, since the same issues arise with both. There seems to me no doubt at all that Jesus himself forbade divorce, possibly subject to the exception recorded in St. Matthew's Gospel, except for porneia, which is usually translated fornication, and usually supposed to mean, unless the other spouse has had extramarital sexual intercourse. So there are no exceptions at all mentioned in the account in St. Mark. There is this mentioned in the this exception, and exactly what it means is unclear, in Matthew, and then St. Paul added an amendment to deal with a situation which did not face Jesus in his ministry. That is, St. Paul was dealing with the case of a Christian husband or wife remarrying if they have a non-Christian spouse who deserts them. And Paul seems to think that that would be okay. While both Catholic and Orthodox have recognized a form of the Pauline privilege, as it's called, and the Orthodox Church has allowed divorce on the grounds of adultery. And although there have been much casuistry involved in determining when a marriage is a valid marriage or not, although there's a couple of possible exceptions and what counts as a marriage under all sorts of difficult circumstances, there can nevertheless be little doubt that if anyone before the year 1700 advocated divorce outside those limits, and in particular advocated divorce by consent, they would have been regarded as heretical. St. Paul, as I say, condemns, St. Paul condemns, that's on divorce. Coming on to porneia, or fornication, that is to say, intercourse outside marriage, St. Paul condemns porneia, and although some of the relevant passages in his letters are compatible with a translation of this as denoting a particular kind of sexual intercourse outside marriage, rather than with all intercourse outside marriage, I don't think all the passages are plausibly so interpreted. And 1 Corinthians 7 condemns all heterosexual intercourse outside marriage, and for the 19 centuries subsequently, church teaching was unanimous in echoing that condemnation. So, pretty unanimous subsequent tradition against that. Now, what reason would God have for prohibiting divorce and for prohibiting sexual intercourse outside marriage? My answer appeals to the evident fact that humans influence each other by their behavior, quite independently of any arguments which they hear for behaving one way or the other. Quote, "Lots of normal people do it. I'm just an ordinary person, so it's unreasonable to expect me to be a total saint." Close quote. That epitomizes the way many humans think about many moral issues. It takes a considerable effort to resist the tide of examples provided by the behavior of others. And this is one thing I wish to stress in all my subsequent remarks, the enormous influence of the example, our example, on others, and theirs on us. And secondly, in this connection, I would appeal to the moral understanding that most of us have of the notion of an ideal family, a marriage of spouses devoted to each other who produce children as a result of a loving act and whose children carry their character and their genes and are brought up by them, and so on. I think this is a marvelous ideal and it needs to be preserved. For arguments for this, one must just go and look around and see and compare and reflect on it. But it seems to me, fairly obviously, a marvelous thing. Now, it is obviously good for anyone to have a partner who loves them and whom they love, when both of them regard loyalty and support of the other as a primary lifelong obligation, and who cooperate in begetting as a result of a loving act, nurturing and educating children in the right way, children who share their genes, share some of their bad habits and their good habits, and so on, who belong to them. These 2 points, that is the points of the enormous influence of examples and the point about the greatness of the family ideal, these 2 points have the consequence that if society normally regarded it as obligatory to confine sexual intercourse to lifelong marriage, and did so confine it, that would make it a lot easier for families to approach this ideal. If sexual intercourse is confined to intercourse within marriage, that will make the intimacy of marriage special, and so to make husband and wife unique partners for each other. Someone who has saved the satisfaction of sexual desire for a spouse will be able to regard and to be regarded by that spouse as uniquely their own. And it is very plausible to suppose that if people get used to having casual sex before marriage, it becomes more natural to commit adultery when the marriage becomes difficult or boring. And it's highly plausible to suppose that the example of many people abstaining from sexual intercourse before marriage will influence others to take their marriage more seriously. The prohibition of divorce is obviously a considerable burden on those whose marriage seems to have broken down. Why should God make divorce difficult or impossible, say for a wife to divorce a cruel though not unfaithful husband? These instructions forbidding divorce have never been seen as forbidding a temporary or even permanent separation in such circumstances, but why should not the wife, or as maybe the husband, marry again? An apparent breakdown of marriage may be repairable, but the repair is much more likely to happen if the spouses regard themselves as bound by their original commitment never to give up attempting to overcome difficulties in the marriage. And even if all attempts of some couples to make their marriages work fail, the persistence of these couples in this task will encourage other couples to try harder to make their marriages work, and these other couples may succeed in this task. And further, if separated spouses do not remarry, that will bring home to others considering marriage the seriousness of the marriage commitment and deter them from entering into marriage too lightly. It would be a fairly useless act just for one person on their own to abstain from sexual intercourse outside marriage or not to divorce a spouse, since it would have, if just one person did it, very little influence. But if God makes it obligatory for everyone to abstain from extramarital sexual intercourse and from divorce, and religious believers recognize this command and seek to obey it, then that would help to create a climate of practice which would have considerable influence on those who seek to break the prohibition, would deter them, many of them. Hence, God has a reason of the kind B that I noted in premise 6 to prohibit such acts. In so doing, in prohibiting such acts, he makes it possible for those who find themselves thereby in a situation where it's difficult to keep the command, he enables them to play a special role in God's plans for humanity, and thus to develop sanctity through generous service to others. The existence of such a climate is perfectly compatible with those who obey the prohibition, showing great sympathy for people in difficult marital situations who break the prohibition. I don't have anything to say in this paper on the attitude the church ought to take to this or that society ought to take to this. I'm only concerned with the behavior of the individual. And if many Christian, or more generally religious people, understood those as the rules, it would make it a lot easier for many people to have happy marriages. I come next to homosexual sexual acts, between consenting adults, that is. It has been traditional to assume that the Bible and subsequent Christian tradition has condemned such acts. I am going to assume, despite the efforts of many to show that the Bible and various theologians all meant something quite different by what seems to many of us apparent condemnations of such acts, I'm going to assume that such passages as 1 Corinthians 6:9 and Romans 1:24 and the continuing weight of subsequent tradition does condemn such acts. And it seems to me fairly obvious, since I can't think of any theologian before the 20th century who had any doubts whatever about that matter. So, what reason would God have for prohibiting such acts? And I suggest that the same kind of consideration applies to the prohibition of homosexual acts as to the prohibition of divorce or extramarital intercourse. Having homosexual orientation is a disability. Disability for the reason that the homosexual cannot beget children through a loving act with the person to whom they have a unique lifelong commitment. Of course, some homosexuals don't want to beget children, but the behavior of others certainly, and often the explicit statement of others, recognizes that they do wish to beget children, and regret that they can't. And a disability is a disability, whether or not the disabled person minds about it. Now, it might one day be possible for some complicated operation to combine the genetic material from 2 sperms or 2 eggs so as to produce a fertilized egg, though there are very considerable difficulties to be overcome before this can be achieved. But if it could be achieved, then 2 lesbians could only produce another female, and 2 gay men would need an egg from another female into which their genetic material could be inserted, and the womb of a surrogate mother in which the fertilized egg could grow into a baby. The whole process would mean that the resulting baby would have 3 or 4 semi-parents, some of whom might not have any subsequent role in nurturing them. And as I read the much disputed evidence available online about whether children nurtured by homosexual parents flourish as well as other children, the balance of that evidence seems to me slightly to indicate that children whose nurturing parents are also their male and female biological parents in a happy marriage flourish better than all other children. And so that is the kind of reproduction and the kind of marriage which we should be encouraging. And those who cannot provide it for their children have a disability. The possible development of this kind of genetic engineering would not alter this fact. Disabilities should be prevented. The evidence seems to me, though I'm treading on ground where all sorts of evidence is popping up every day and disputed and so on, but as I see it, the evidence seems to me to indicate clearly that genes and environment, nature and nurture, both play a role in determining sexual orientation, and that this orientation is sometimes to a considerable extent reversible. So, if there was a general recognition in society of an obligation to abstain from homosexual acts. That would prevent homosexual behavior being presented as an option for young people of equal value to the heterosexual one, which makes possible procreative marriage. And that presenting to them as an equal possibility. If you don't present it to them as an equal possibility, then the young wouldn't start wondering about whether they're really homosexual when, but for it being presented to them, it wouldn't have occurred to them. In consequence, experimenting with homosexual sexual acts, getting accustomed to such behavior, and so developing a homosexual orientation is something to be prevented. And it would be prevented by a climate of opinion which would hold, which would teach homosexual acts are wrong, and that would encourage those who have begun to develop such an orientation to go no further. And it would encourage research into how the orientation can be cured. Medicine has made great strides in recent years. Diseases of mind or body hitherto believed incurable have proved curable. It would be very odd if sexual orientation was the only incurable condition. But it does look as if for many homosexuals, but probably not for all, their condition is now uncurable. And sympathy, not censure, must be our first reaction, as it must be in all the situations which I'm considering, when people, not by their own choice, cannot satisfy their sexual longings in a happy marriage. Nevertheless, if older and incurable homosexuals abstained from homosexual acts, that would have a great influence on young and curable ones, and the older ones would be doing a great service to others, and one which would help to make those older ones saints. But of course, if I'm mistaken in supposing that the climate of clear yet sympathetic opinion would make any difference to the sexual orientation of any humans who would otherwise acquire a homosexual orientation, then my argument will fail, and we would need to look for some other reason why God would prohibit homosexual acts. But I stress that inability to discover a reason why God might have prohibited one kind of act would hardly count much against the reliability of the Church's moral tradition that God had prohibited acts of all the other sorts I'm considering, although inability to discover any reasons why God might have prohibited any of these kinds of acts would certainly count significantly against the reliability of the Church's general moral tradition. I come next to the issue of contraception within marriage. Although, in my view, the Bible expresses no clear view about the morality of the temporary use of contraception within marriage, all such contraception was condemned with virtual unanimity by those fathers and scholastics who expressed a view. Their justification for this condemnation must therefore lie in its derivability from unwritten tradition. Now, if one holds, as many of the fathers and scholastics seem to have held, that procreation was the sole divinely ordained purpose for sexual intercourse, then it does immediately follow that contraception is a wrong to God, for it is using the divine gift of sex for a purpose contrary to the donor's wishes. There is, however, quite a lot in the Bible which understands sexual intercourse as a cement for the companionship of marriage, which is a good in itself. While in the Genesis 1 account of God creating men and women, God said to Adam and Eve, quote, "Be fruitful and multiply," in the Genesis 2 account of this, God created women as, quote, "helpers" and, quote, "partners for men, in consequence of which, quote, "they become one flesh." And Jesus himself cited the Genesis 2 words, "become one flesh," as what happens in marriage. And some of the fathers recognized the uniting of married couples as a good purpose of sexual intercourse, additional to the purpose of procreation. But since it is acknowledged that marriage has at least one good purpose other than procreation, the issue arises whether it might be legitimate to have intercourse in order to fulfill the other purpose or purposes when procreation would not be a good thing. That procreation was sometimes not a good thing was often acknowledged in ancient times. Lactantius speaks of a Christian who is too poor to raise a large family. Quote, "The only solution for such a man is absolute continence." Yet why should it be wrong to have intercourse while taking steps to avoid procreation? Unless God had forbidden it, no one would be wronged thereby. So why would God have forbidden it? To answer this question, we need to follow Augustine in distinguishing, as I mentioned at an earlier point in the lecture, in distinguishing between those commands directed only to a certain group of people and those directed to all people at all times. We can, I suggest, recognize the former group, those directed only to a certain group, if we can see the point of God issuing the command being constituted by the circumstances in which the group to which they were originally directed lived, but which have no point in other present circumstances. For example, until the 14th century, Christians believed that God had forbidden usury, that is, lending money which the borrower had to return with interest. But note that until the 14th century, most money lending was lending by the rich to the poor, and surely the poverty of the borrower provides a good reason for God to forbid the lender to demand interest. But since that time, the growth of complicated financial arrangements has had the consequence that much money lending is by the comparatively well-off to prosperous businesses who hope to make a lot of money out of it. And then, of course, the wealth of the borrower means that there's no longer any reason to forbid the lender demanding interest. That is, I'm giving this as an example where there is a point in the command being issued in the circumstances of the time. But when the circumstances of the time are quite different, as they are now, there would be no point in the command. And if we can recognize a command as of that kind, that there would be a point in issuing it in the first century because of circumstances then operative, which circumstances are no longer operative, that is a reason for classifying it as one of those commands which sure was applicable but is no longer. Now, bearing that in mind, what's the point of God forbidding contraception? If he did forbid that, then presumably because, as Genesis 1 reports God saying to Adam, as Genesis 1 reports God saying to Adam and Eve, he wanted humans to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That is to say, the point of forbidding contraception was that there should be a lot of humans. Now, it's plausible to suppose that if contraception had been practiced widely in earlier centuries, the human race would simply have died out. But plausibly, humans are now much nearer to, quote, filling the earth. If contraception were not practiced now, the earth would soon become very crowded, and indeed too crowded to grow enough food to feed all humans. And that, I suggest, is a reason why, as with usury, the circumstances which made the command a good one for God to issue no longer hold. And so it's plausible to suppose that contraception within marriage is no longer wrong. But again, if I'm wrong about this, we'd need to look for some other reason why God would have forbidden it. And this brings me back to the issue of the morality of early abortion, which, on a substance dualist view, would not constitute homicide. Yet despite the fact that most of the Christian fathers were substance dualists, early abortion was still regarded as a mortal sin. So why? Aquinas, for example, considers that, following Aristotle, that for the first, I've forgotten how many days it is, 50 or whatever, the fetus is a vegetable, and then it becomes an animal, and then it becomes a human. So he doesn't think it's homicide at the early stage. So why would God have forbidden it? Why it might be the case that contraception is now not forbidden because God intended sexual intercourse to serve not merely the purpose of procreation, but also the purpose of cementing the unity of the married couple. But pregnancy has no other conceivable purpose for which God would have provided it. And as to say, sexual intercourse has two obvious purposes at least. But there's only one obvious purpose of pregnancy, and that is to produce another human being. So God might reasonably have commanded us not to interrupt this process, just as we, if we give some child the seed of a rare and beautiful flower, might well tell the child to weed and water it so that it eventually flowered, and be very annoyed if the child just threw it away. Forbidding abortion will not lead to an overpopulated world so long as contraception is used to a moderate degree. So I'm suggesting that although for a non-substance dualist all abortion would count as homicide, for a substance dualist it wouldn't. So why would God forbid it? Well, because once the pregnancy has started, God has ordained this as the process by which children should be produced. And so we are cutting off a process which has only one divinely ordained purpose, that is to say, to fill the world with more children. So that suggests a reason, though not, of course, as strong a reason as the homicide one, why God might have forbidden both, even for substance dualists, might have forbidden abortion. And finally, I come to the issue of family headship. Quote, "Wives, be subject to your husbands," wrote the author of the letter to the Ephesians, an instruction repeated in other New Testament letters. Until the last 100 years, Christians have always regarded the husband as the head of the family, centered on husband and wife, who should nurture and educate their children. Yet it seems to me that there's no necessary moral truth which would make male headship obligatory. It requires an explicit divine command to do so. But clearly, any institution needs a system for resolving differences about how the institution should act. Some sort of, quote, majority vote system is used by many institutions. But of course, that's of no use in a two-member organization such as marriage. Clearly, too, the married couple ought to seek agreement on matters central to the institution, if they can, on where they should live, how their children should be educated, and so on. But if they cannot reach agreement in a reasonable finite time, one of them must have a casting vote. Otherwise, the marriage will only survive if one spouse is emotionally weaker or less selfish or keener that the marriage should survive than is the other. Better to have a clear legal rule, one dependent on virtually unalterable differences in the nature of the two spouses and their role in sexual intercourse and the procreation of children. God might have had some reason for making the husband head of the family, or he may have done so by an arbitrary decision in virtue of having a reason to make an arbitrary decision of kind A. Just as with driving on the left or driving on the right, it doesn't matter which rule is adopted, but it does matter that some rules should be adopted. And just as the state which owns the roads has the right to lay down that rule, so God, who instituted marriage, has the right to lay down who should be the head of the family. The common principle at work in all these obligations and prohibitions, all the ones created by the will of God, is that some of us are required to conform to the obligation or prohibition for the sake of others. The other spouse, or others in other marriages, or others not yet married, or others yet to be born. Many of these obligations and prohibitions are designed to create a climate of opinion where marriage will be regarded as a sacred institution in which loving couples can produce a loving family. They are designed to secure the institution against influences which weaken it and to make it possible for more humans to enter into it. The prohibitions and obligations are only likely to have this effect if many people conform to them. God has the reason for imposing them as obligations on all of us so that we may help the marriages of others and thereby make ourselves naturally good people. Thank you.